Mail-order bride saves two ranchers' girls. Next day, their father arrives with a shocking reward. Witness this unbelievable, true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The story begins in the wide-open plains of Texas during the late 1800s, where the land seemed endless and the sky stretched forever in shades of blue and gold. Life out here was harsh and often unforgiving, but it was also a place where men built their dreams from sweat and grit. Among them was a hard-working rancher named Thomas McGraw. Thomas was a man who had known both great joy and great sorrow. Once he had a wife he adored and a home filled with laughter. But after an illness swept through their small town, he was left a widower, raising his two young daughters, Emily and Sarah, on his own. Emily, just 8 years old, had her mother's bright smile. Though it appeared less often now, Sarah, only 6, clung to her father every chance she got, afraid he too might one day leave. Thomas did all he could to keep their small world together, but ranch life demanded long hours. The cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and the fields stretched for miles. His daughters were often left in the care of one another, too young to shoulder such responsibility. In the evenings, when Thomas returned bone-tired, he would sit by the fire with them, listening to their chatter, braiding their hair clumsily, and trying to fill the silence his late wife had once filled so easily. But the truth was clear. He could not do it alone forever. The loneliness ate at him, and he worried constantly about what would become of his girls if something ever happened to him. It was then that he made a decision that would change everything. He wrote to an agency in St. Louis that arranged what folks called mail-order marriages. Women from the East, often poor, widowed, or seeking new beginnings, could write letters to men in the West who needed wives, companions and mothers for their children. It was not a path Thomas ever imagined for himself, but desperation has a way of guiding choices. He prayed that someone kind, someone gentle might answer his call. That someone was Clara Dawson. Clara was just 22, raised in the crowded streets of St. Louis, where factory smoke darkened the skies and opportunities for a young woman were scarce. She had no family left. Her parents had died when she was a girl, and her aunt who had raised her recently passed away as well. With little tying her to the city, she dreamed of wide horizons, fresh air, and a chance to make a life of her own. When she read Thomas's letter, speaking of two little girls who needed care and a ranch that needed a woman's touch, something stirred in her heart. She packed her few belongings, boarded a train heading west, and prayed that she would find both a home and a purpose in the vast unknown. The day Clara arrived at the dusty station near the McGraw Ranch, Emily and Sarah hid behind their father's legs, peeking out shyly at the stranger stepping down from the train. Clara's dress was plain, but neatly pressed, and her hair was tied back in a simple braid. Her eyes, however, shone with determination. She smiled warmly at the girls, though they didn't return it just yet. Thomas introduced her with a stiff nod, still unsure of what to expect. He was a man who carried grief like a shadow, and Clara felt it instantly. The first days were quiet. Clara settled into the ranch house, helping with cooking, cleaning, and tending to the small garden out back. The girls watched her carefully, testing her patience, asking questions about the city, and whispering to each other when they thought she wasn't listening. Slowly, she began to win them over. She read them bedtime stories by lantern light, sewed new ribbons into their hair, and taught them little songs from her childhood. Emily soon started to follow her around the house, while Sarah, though more cautious, began to slip her small hand into Clara's whenever they walked the fields. Thomas noticed, though he tried not to show it. At night, he lay awake in his bed, hearing the soft laughter drifting down the hallway, and realizing how much lighter the house felt with Clara in it. Yet he kept his heart guarded. She was here because of an arrangement, nothing more, and he would not let himself believe in anything beyond that. One evening, as a storm brewed in the distance, Thomas saddled his horse to drive cattle to the far pasture. "I'll be gone until morning," he told Clara, his voice steady but his eyes betraying worry. Clara nodded confidently. "Don't worry about the girls. They'll be safe with me." He rode off into the gathering darkness, unaware of the danger that would soon come. As the night deepened, rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the plains. The girls huddled close to Clara as she told them a story to keep their minds from the storm. But then, over the sound of the wind, came another noise, the creak of the front gate and heavy footsteps on the porch. Clara's heart raced as the door rattled violently. Before she could react, two rough-looking men pushed their way inside. They were drifters, ragged and desperate, smelling of whiskey and rain. One sneered at Clara, while the other eyed the house hungrily. "Ain't nobody home but you and the young'uns?" one of them muttered. Emily and Sarah clung to Clara's skirt, their eyes wide with terror. Fear surged through Clara, but something stronger rose above it, protectiveness. Her eyes darted to the mantel where Thomas's revolver rested. In one swift motion, she grabbed it, her hands steady despite her pounding heart. The drifters froze, shocked that the young woman before them had the courage to arm herself. "I suggest you leave," Clara said firmly, her voice sharper than the thunder outside. The men laughed nervously at first, thinking she was bluffing. But then Clara raised the gun, aimed it at the ceiling, and fired a warning shot that cracked like lightning through the room. Plaster rained down, and the drifters' laughter turned to panic. They stumbled backward, muttering curses as they fled into the stormy night. For a long moment silence filled the house, except for the sound of rain. Clara lowered the revolver, her hands trembling only after the danger was gone. She turned to the girls, who were crying softly, and knelt down to gather them into her arms. "It's all right," she whispered, rocking them gently. "No one will hurt you, I promise." The girls clung to her through the night, and though fear lingered, there was also a new bond between them. Clara was no longer just a stranger from the city. She was their protector, someone who had stood between them and harm when it mattered most. By the time dawn broke and the storm passed, the ranch house stood quiet again. Clara had not slept, keeping watch by the window, the revolver still within reach. When Thomas finally returned, tired from his work and unaware of what had happened, he was met by Emily rushing into his arms. "Papa!" she cried. "Clara saved us. 2 bad men came, but she chased them away with your gun." Thomas's face went pale as the words sank in. He turned to Clara, who stood in the doorway, her eyes tired but steady. In that moment, something shifted inside him. He saw not just a woman brought here by arrangement, but a soul with courage, strength, and love enough to protect his family as fiercely as he ever could. He set Emily down and walked slowly toward Clara, his gaze never leaving hers. Though the shocking reward of his gratitude was yet to come, in that first look he gave her, Clara knew everything was about to change. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, rain still dripping from his coat as Emily's words echoed in his ears. His heart pounded, not just from the shock of danger, but from the realization of what had nearly been lost. He had spent years fearing that his daughters might one day be left alone in this harsh world, but never once had he imagined that strangers could bring such danger to his very doorstep. His eyes moved slowly from Emily to Sarah, both clinging to Clara's skirts, their little faces flushed from tears. Then his gaze settled on Clara herself, and something inside him shifted. She was not trembling with fear or making excuses for what she had done. Instead, she stood tall, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady despite the shadows beneath them. He could see the exhaustion etched across her face, the toll of a sleepless night, yet there was also quiet strength radiating from her. She had not run, she had not broken. She had protected his children as though they were her own. For a man like Thomas, whose life had been built on hard work, loyalty and the code of the land, that meant everything. Words did not come easily to him, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. Finally he stepped forward, setting his hat on the table with a soft thud. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. Clara explained what had happened, her voice calm, though her hands twisted slightly in front of her. She told him about the drifters, about the way they pushed their way inside, about the fear in the girl's eyes. And she told him how she had taken his revolver, how she had fired a warning shot that had sent the men running. She left nothing out, her words measured, her tone steady. Thomas listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every detail. By the time she finished, the air between them was heavy with silence. He exhaled slowly, as though letting out the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Then he looked at Emily and Sarah, still pressed close against Clara's sides, their small hands gripping her dress. "They trust you," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. His daughters had always been shy with strangers, yet here they were, holding on to Clara as though she were the safest place in the world. That trust could not be faked, could not be bought. It was earned in the hardest way possible, through love and courage, in the face of danger. That evening, after he had checked the property and made sure no one lingered near, Thomas sat on the porch with Clara. The girls had fallen asleep inside, worn out from the long night. The lantern light flickered between them, throwing shadows across Thomas's weathered face. For a while neither spoke. Then Thomas turned, his voice lower than the hum of the night insects. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said. "You could have hidden with the girls, or prayed those men wouldn't harm you. But you didn't. You stood your ground. You saved them." Clara looked down at her folded hands. "They're good girls," she said softly. "They've already lost enough. I wasn't going to let anyone take more from them." Her words pierced straight through him. For years, he had carried the burden of protecting Emily and Sarah alone. He had thought no one else could understand the weight of that responsibility, the endless worry that each day might bring danger. But here was this young woman, barely more than a stranger, who had taken that burden onto herself without hesitation. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice rough when he spoke again. "Clara, I brought you here because I thought my girls needed someone to look after them. A caretaker, maybe a teacher, maybe someday a wife if time made it right. But I see now. God didn't just send me help. He sent me someone who belongs here." Clara's breath caught, and she turned her gaze to him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "What are you saying?" For the first time in years, Thomas's expression softened. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. "I can't pay you with money, Clara. I can't reward you with gold or land or anything this world counts as valuable. The only reward I can offer is the truth, that I don't want you here as a stranger anymore. I want you as my wife, not because of some letter or arrangement, but because you've proven you're already part of this family." Clara's lips parted, but no words came at first. She had come west expecting nothing more than survival. Maybe a roof over her head, maybe the distant kindness of a man who needed her labor more than her presence. She had never dreamed of hearing words like these. Thomas stood then, surprising her, and to her utter astonishment, he went down on one knee right there on the porch. His broad-shouldered frame looked almost vulnerable in that posture, but his voice was steady. "Clara Dawson, will you marry me? Not by arrangement, not by duty, but by choice, by love." The world seemed to still. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of the wind in the grass, the glow of the lantern, all of it faded as Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized that this was no longer about survival, no longer about fleeing the emptiness of the city. This was about belonging, about love, about a future she had not dared hope for. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking, then stronger. "Yes, Thomas, I will." At that moment, Emily and Sarah appeared sleepily in the doorway, rubbing their eyes. "Papa?" Emily murmured, confused. But when she saw Clara's tears and Thomas kneeling, a smile spread across her face. Sarah, too young to fully understand, clapped her hands in delight simply because she saw joy lighting up the faces of the people she loved. Thomas rose and gathered Clara into his arms, holding her close as though he never wanted to let go. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to believe that happiness was possible again. He kissed her gently, sealing the promise not just of marriage, but of a family healed. The days that followed were filled with change, but they were changes that brought warmth rather than worry. The girls no longer looked to Clara with the hesitant eyes of children unsure of a stranger. Instead, they ran to her when they scraped a knee, they tugged at her dress to show her their drawings, they begged her for stories before bed. She had become their mother in every way that mattered. Thomas worked the ranch with a lighter heart, his shoulders less bowed by grief. When he came home at sundown, the sound of laughter greeted him at the door. He often found Clara at the table with the girls, teaching them their letters by lamplight, or out in the yard, showing them how to hang laundry on the line. Sometimes he would pause, leaning against the doorframe, simply watching. He marveled that a house once so heavy with silence could now be filled with such light. Yet, in quiet moments, Thomas still thought about that night. The storm, the intruders, the gunshot. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything. Each time he did, his gratitude deepened, not just for Clara's courage, but for the way she had chosen them. She had not run from danger. She had embraced it, and in doing so, she had embraced them. Months later, under the shade of a sprawling oak tree near the ranch, Thomas and Clara were wed. The ceremony was simple, attended only by a few neighbors and the preacher who rode in from town. Emily and Sarah wore little white dresses Clara had sewn herself, their hair braided with wildflowers they had picked that morning. They stood proudly beside their father as he spoke his vows, their small hands clutching Clara's with unshakable trust. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Emily whispered to Sarah, "She's really ours now," and Sarah, with the unfiltered honesty of a child, replied, "She was ours the night she saved us." Thomas smiled at their words, his heart swelling with a gratitude so deep it nearly brought him to tears. He looked at Clara, radiant in her plain but beautiful gown, and knew with certainty that his life had been saved alongside his daughter's that stormy night. The reward he had given her was not land or riches. It was his heart, his family, his promise of forever. And for Clara, that was more than enough. From that day forward, the McGraw Ranch was no longer a place of sorrow, but a home of hope, laughter, and love. The mail-order bride, who had come seeking a new beginning, had found something far greater, a family who would love her for the rest of her days. And though the world outside the ranch still carried its hardships, within those walls there was peace.